developments, what will be the place of Europe in this fast-changing world and more dangerous neighborhood? Of course, to answer this question, we first need a diagnosis about what kind of international relations is emerging. So that will be your first task, and in particular Anand's task, but I'm sure Sergio will have also interesting things to say about that. Throughout this conversation, and I want this to be a conversation as much as possible rather than a panel, I don't want us to lose sight of a related question, which is, what can the Europeans and the US do? Can they do anything about their fate and about Europe's fate? So that will be your second task. It's a very tall order for the two panelists. As much as possible, as I said, we will try to have a free conversation, and I may take the liberty to interrupt you when I have a question that comes to my mind and when I think a clarification may be useful. We will start with Anand to provide us with the big picture. And then Sergio will react and speak more about the domestic dimension of these challenges, both in Europe and in the US. So first, Anand, I remember when I started my dissertation, everybody was talking, so that's a while back in the late 90s, everybody was talking about Europe's security ambitions. You were actually one of the doomsayers, or at least one of the most cautious analysts at the time, and I think arguably you turned out to be right. What happened that made you right? Anand, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Frédéric. I don't think I've ever before sat in a lecture room where I couldn't physically see the back row. I'm not sure whether that's because lecture rooms have become bigger or my eyes have become worse, but this really is a daunting place to be doing this. What I've basically done is I've sort of padded out the initial 5-minute remarks that I'd prepared for what was going to be the original roundtable into something a little bit longer and more substantive. And my basic argument is this about the transatlantic relations. The relationship with the United States protected Europe for much of the 20th century. But at the same time, it has increasingly hobbled Europe because through a habit of dependence, Europeans have become blind to geopolitics and increasingly materially incapable of dealing with the challenges they face in this ever-changing world that Frédéric has mentioned. So what I'm going to do briefly is sketch some of the global challenges that Europe faces, and then talk briefly about this strategic blindness that characterizes Europe now, and the increasing inability that Europeans suffer from when it comes to attempts to deal with these myriad challenges that they face. Now, this is going to be synoptic, obviously, because the world is a big and complicated place, but there are several trends we can identify that are of direct interest to and impinge directly upon European interests. The first is the most obvious, which is that power is diffusing away from the West. We live in a world where there are emerging powers, and the growing international assertiveness of these powers can be measured in several ways. Firstly, within their own neighborhood. One of the things that's most striking about Asia today is the rise of tensions between Asian powers as the Chinese seek to spread their influence into the South China Sea. You have the Chinese Ring of Pearls strategy with naval bases there, creating tension with numerous neighbors. That, in a sense, realism might have predicted. Rising powers cause trouble. More of a shock, perhaps, to the West has been the fact that states that we might have considered natural allies have also started to pose a challenge to the international order that the West created out of the Second World War. India was a member of the United Nations Security Council in 2011, but was openly critical of attempts by the West to intervene in Libya, tried to block any attempts to the West to intervene in Syria. Along with Brazil, India abstained on the United Nations General Assembly vote on Crimea. So what we have are not just rising powers, but rising powers that are increasingly willing and able to stand up to the positions taken by the West. And these countries are becoming more powerful. They're becoming more powerful economically, as we all know. But the other thing worth bearing in mind is that the Asia-Pacific is the only region in the world where military spending has grown year on year since 2008, 2009. This year's figures will almost certainly reveal that China spent more on defense than the UK, France, and Germany combined. And this all matters to Europe, and it matters to Europe for several reasons. Firstly, and we often forget this, a higher proportion of European trade is with Asia than with the United States. So we're crucially dependent on Asia for trade. Secondly, and more generally, a trading power like Europe is fundamentally dependent on the maintenance of the liberal rules-based international order in order that trade can continue in the way it has since the Second World War. This can be everything from avoiding conflict to keeping over open sea lanes of communication. But we have a vested interest in Europe of this stable, rules-based liberal international order persevering. That's the global picture, if you like, and it's one of increasing stability and increasing challenge. And the picture is precisely the same, if not worse, closer to home. To the south, we've had the collapse of authority in Libya, we have civil war in Syria, we have the threat posed by ISIL, both internally within societies such as Britain and France, and externally through their actions in the Middle East. We have consequent mass movements of migrants across the Mediterranean, as we've all seen. To the south, Europe's neighbourhood is highly unstable, and Europe has acted as a virtual spectator as events since the Arab Spring have unfolded. And one of the most uncomfortable realities facing Europe, I think, in this new southern neighbourhood is it's not anymore the only actor that is interested. Europe faces competition. When it comes to trying to persuade the Egyptians to play nicely with promises of European money, we were outbid by the Gulf states, which didn't have to go through a cumbersome process. They simply wrote Sisi a check. We face competition for influence in these regions, which limits our ability to try and help them develop in ways we like. And this is even more striking to the east, of course. Constanza was going to talk a little bit about Russia, and she knows far more about it than I do. But one of the things that is clear is that European actions towards its eastern neighbourhood in the run-up to the Vilnius summit, which sparked the events in Ukraine, were, I think, characterized by two things. On the one hand, a geopolitical naivety, which, if you like, was testified to by the utter surprise in Brussels that the Russians didn't like what was happening in Vilnius. No one had thought through the geopolitical implications of what was happening in the Eastern Partnership and Europe's efforts to sort of extend its system of governance into Russia's own backyard. And also, I think, a certain amount of hubris. Many in Brussels were simply taken aback that there might be people in Ukraine and in the eastern neighbourhood who might prefer an other route to the European route, that the European model isn't perhaps as attractive to everyone in the European neighbourhood as we'd have liked to have thought. So Europe faces numerous challenges both locally and globally. And it's worth bearing in mind that Europe, more than at any time since the Second World War, faces the prospect of having to deal with these challenges alone. The United States is no longer as willing as it has been to act as Europe's protector for several reasons. Firstly, you have a change of policy at the top. Combined with the so-called pivot to Asia, you have the Obama doctrine, which urges strategic caution, and which is characterized by a reluctance to get involved in security crises around the world, and which is predicated on a belief that America's allies need to do more to assure stability in their own backyards. American public opinion mirrors this. In spring 2014, twice as many Americans believed that the United States should not get involved in the crisis in Ukraine as believed that the Americans had a role to play. And this sort of isolationist tendency in foreign policy seems to be getting stronger, judging by recent Pew polls. And the Americans have coined this notion of leading from behind. That is to say, they want to see their allies take the lead in crises, whether it's in Libya, the Central African Republic, whether it's negotiating with Iran, whether it's Mali, whilst they provide backup support if and when necessary, but grudgingly at best. So we face a whole series of international challenges, and we face the prospect of doing so without our protector being there to take them on for us. Now, what is interesting is the Americans have long debated the implications of multipolarity. They've long debated the implications of emerging powers to the American position in the world. There is in Europe, by contrast, a striking lack of strategic debate about what Europe's place in the world is, what Europe's place in the world should be. One piece of evidence for this is the way we in Europe talk about TTIP. On the one hand, we're delighted to discuss economics, getting rid of harmonizing regulations, getting rid of tariff barriers. There's almost a kind of displacement activity that if we're talking about international politics, we're comfortable talking about the economics. What is completely missing in the European debate is any sense of the geopolitics of TTIP. The American debate is perfectly explicit about this. TTIP is part of a broader strategy of trying to unite the Western world against potential challenges, both economic and security. In Europe, the security and geopolitical dimension is missing. And this is paradoxical because, of course, geography weighs far more heavily on Europeans than it does on the Americans. We don't have the moats of the Pacific and the Atlantic to defend us. The Mediterranean is not a very big sea at all. Europe is directly challenged by instability in North Africa in a way that the Americans simply aren't. So why is it that the Europeans have this aversion to geopolitics? Well, one answer is the economic crisis. We have become even more so than normal, introspective and parochial. The impact of the economic crisis has commanded the attention of our leaders, has dominated the agenda of European summits to the exclusion of virtually everything else. Second reason is that the European Union is simply ill-adapted to dealing with international challenges. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. The EU was an institution that was designed to diffuse power in the aftermath of the Second World War. It shouldn't shock us, therefore, that when we ask it to deploy power, its structures prove to be pretty inadequate. The European Union adopts, because it was designed to adopt, a highly programmatic approach to international politics. We can sign the programs with the Tunisians that say if you behave nicely in 10 years' time, we might reward you with mobility or whatever it might be. But we can't deal in a decisive way with international challenges in the way that some of our competitors in the neighbourhood can. A third reason, I think a very significant reason for European geostrategic blindness, is a culture of dependence. Back at the ECPR conference in Potsdam, I think it was about 5 years ago now, John Mearsheimer gave the keynote, and he spoke about the transatlantic relationship. And he spoke about America as Europe's pacifier. Why is there peace in Europe? Because of the Americans, a very traditional, if you like, realist take on world politics. What he failed to mention was the way in which America's role in Europe since the Second World War has changed the way Europeans do international relations. American protection gave the Europeans the space to think about world politics as being essentially about economics, because the Americans would deal with the difficult bits of security. Look at our dealings with China. It's the Americans that deal with the Chinese air identification system. It's the Americans that negotiate the Chinese on contested boundaries and territories in the South China Sea. When Europeans deal with China, when they deal with Asia as a whole, we talk economics and we seek economic gain. We are able to leave the difficult stuff to Washington. Recently, David Cameron went to Southeast Asia, did not mention security tensions in that region at all. But he signed a number of trade deals while he was there. This is the new European blindness to the reality of international politics. In short, what I would say is that American reassurance has bred not only security in Europe, but complacency. And that complacency is dangerous because it transfers itself, because it translates into real-world resource shortfalls. In a material sense, European states are no longer able to deal with the challenges they face. European states have recently been involved in a number of small-scale conflicts to the south in both Mali and Libya. And what is striking about both of these, particularly Libya, is that when confronted with a profoundly third-rate military, the Europeans were unable to deal with it by themselves. The Italians sent an aircraft carrier and had to send it home halfway through because of budget constraints. The French sent an aircraft carrier, they had to send it home halfway through the conflict because it needed maintenance. The Brits don't have an aircraft carrier because we can't afford one. We're in the process of buying one, but it's costing so much that we can't afford the aircraft to put on it. So what use that will turn out to be is far from clear. By the end of the conflict in Libya, the French had run out of precision munitions to the point where the French Air Force was dropping, and I kid you not, pieces of concrete on Libyan army positions. This was justified in a press statement as a way of avoiding collateral damage, which wasn't wholly convincing. Europeans, because they've got into the habit of leaving security to the Americans, have failed to invest in the necessary means to assure their own security. And this, of course, has become far, far worse as a result of the economic crisis. Defence budgets across the continent have been slashed, in some of the smaller member states by up to 25%, in some of the bigger member states by 8 or 10%. Britain is now one of the few island states that has no maritime surveillance capability. We cannot tell if Russian submarines are in our waters without borrowing planes from our allies. The other aspect of this, of course, is because we always assumed that the Americans would do the dirty work for us, we were able to play at being great powers without incurring the cost. And one of the side effects of this has been a continued reluctance to cooperate when it comes to foreign policy. Even the largest European states cannot deal with international challenges alone anymore. They could do so if they acted together. Europeans combined spend 190 billion euros a year on defence, which puts us second after the United States. The fact that we spend them in an uncoordinated manner between 28 different defence industries and 28 national militaries means we spend that money very, very badly, and means we continue to suffer from the kinds of weaknesses I've outlined. So just very, very quickly in conclusion, the two issues that come out of this for me in a sort of policy or conceptual sense are, one, the fundamental problem facing Americans, it seems to me, is a question of moral hazard, which is how do you continue to offer support to the Europeans without encouraging them to be lazy and feckless, which, frankly, over the course of the last 50 or 60 years, we have got into the habit of being. And the puzzle for us is European integration has traditionally been a way in which states make up for national incapacity by acting together. They use integration to achieve collectively things they are unable to achieve individually. Why has this not been the case in foreign and security policy? There are all sorts of unsatisfactory answers in the literature to do with high politics or sovereignty. They're not convincing. If we're willing to give up our money, why are we not willing to collaborate on defence? And I think this is one of the great challenges that will face Europe in the years to come, and something that we as political scientists need to spend perhaps a bit more time trying to understand.
Thank you, Anand, for this. Thank you, Anand, for getting us started. Maybe I'll turn to Sergio for his own remarks. I think so. No.
Okay, thanks very much for the invitation, because I don't know exactly if I had to substitute Constance or Pierre. I decided to go along my road. Multiple principle increase the autonomy of the agent. So I just, and my road means that I will try to look at the transatlantic relation from the point of view of domestic politics. And if one looks at the transatlantic relation from the perspective of domestic politics, the future of the transatlantic relation appear even more problematic than the one emerging from the Anand perspective of international relations. Both the US domestic politics and EU interstate division do not constitute favorable conditions for advancing in transatlantic cooperation, both at the economic trade level and the security military level. However, the uncertain basis of the transatlantic cooperation are not a feature of the current situation. Indeed, it is a regular condition, a regular property of the transatlantic relation because of the institutional setting that characterize both the US and the European Union. So we are within the norm, but that, of course, is not a good news inevitably. So let's see the American side. The two Obama presidency have not been characterized by an active and consistent foreign policy. Leadership from behind has been motivated by a change of the international global system, which has witnessed the growing role as an new power like China, although not necessarily the decline of the old power, the US. In a no one world, as it was called by a prominent IR scholar, the US is necessary but no longer sufficient for solving international or regional crises. So what I'm saying and what I see is a dramatic process of adaptation has taken place within the U.S. and the political system of the U.S. is not ready, is not prepared, has not the sufficient characterization in order to deal with this process of adaptation. The U.S. should change its own role in the global system and does not have the legitimacy and material resources for dealing with that change. So here I would say it is probably the very first time after the Second World War in which the US has to develop a new conception about its role at the global level, but for the very first time there is no domestic consensus regarding this transformation. Indeed, this process of historical readjustment is taking place in the context of the most polarized domestic politics ever in the US democracy, probably since the end of the Civil War. There is probably a correlation, although not a causation, between the necessity to readjust the international role of the country and the deepening of the division between the two main parties and also within each of them. But in any case, what is striking to me is that if one look at the debate on foreign policy, I don't see the kind of consistent view that in some way Anand mentioned. This redefinition of the role of the US is taking place in a domestic political system which is ridden by deep division, polarized position, also personal animosity, as the US never faced, at least in recent time. If that is true, then even in Washington, D.C., there is not a phone to call for being informed on the choices the country has decided or would decide to make. One might fairly add that notwithstanding this permanent and radical opposition of the Republican Congress against Obama administration, at least since 2010, and particularly in the second mandate, the President Obama has been, however, effective in handling some very crucial notes of U.S. foreign policy, from Cuba to Iran. Of course, in the U.S. compound democracy, the President has leverage on the Congress in foreign policy, but of course not in domestic politics. But party polarization of the last period, 10, 15 years, is calling to question even this historical convention, making thus impossible for the President to elaborate a consistent approach to the readjustment of the country in the new international scenario. So the deep domestic cleavages between parties and governmental institutions, the divided government that regularly characterize the American system, can explain the periodical contrast between words and deeds emerging from the Obama foreign policy. This division has even entered within the administration. Between a group of people supporting a very idealistic foreign policy and a group of people sticking with a realistic view of foreign policy. And the president was not able, at least has not been able so far, to manage effectively this division within his same administration. Probably, as some of my colleagues say, is too thoughtful for being a leader, and he has not the kind of political animal attitude that other presidents had in dealing with internal division. Anyway, the TTIP is a further example of the difficulty to develop a coherent transatlantic trade policy in Washington, D.C. The Democratic Party is divided within itself, and a Republican Congress is not eager at all to give the Democratic president a policy success in this regard. There will be yet a lot of swinging and rocking in trade negotiation and in security, at least till the next election year, 2016. But also the situation within the European Union is very complicated, as Anand mentioned, and probably even more complicated if we look at some crucial issue like immigration. The European Union has structural limits in defining a common foreign policy. For its interstate character, it's a union of states, and states have different view concerning foreign policy depending on their own geographical condition, historical heritage, size, memory, national culture, and so forth. So the high variation of foreign policy predisposition between the European Union member states has made inevitably the EU the perfect candidate for getting the degree in the science of free riding. And in some way, normative Europe is the answer to this incapacity for structural reason of elaborating a common foreign policy. And this incapacity has, of course, these historical roots, but it has been in some way institutionalized by a specific model of organizing decision-making process in the foreign policy field, namely the intergovernmental model. Exactly as we are witnessing in the economic and monetary union, the intergovernmental model is not a model able to solve basic challenges of collective action. And here we have plenty of, let's say, empirical evidences that the intergovernmental model is a recipe for stalemate foreign policy and not a condition for moving on. So the US, one should say, has also traditionally played on this division, complaining during the day on the European lack of contribution to the common security, but then feeling more secure with this leadership unquestioned in night time. So there is a sort of ambiguity from the US side. They ask for a more active role of the European foreign policy, especially in defense budget, but at the same time, there are quarters of the US political elite that in some way fear a more active role from the European side. So the financial crisis has made even deeper the interstate division in the EU. The Eurozone has dramatically and critically advanced in the process of integration, where the opt-out member states, in particular the UK, have followed a more nationalistic trajectory. So what we are witnessing, again from a domestic point of view, is the emergence of a proper conflict of interest between the Eurozone and the other, let's say, monetary areas. Regarding basic issue of international policy, like economic and trade, but also immigration. Look how the UK called immediately itself out of a common European answer to the challenge of immigration. The renationalization in economic terms has gone much farther than the economic term. It has entered other area, crucial area of state policy. So Brexit, if it happened, might be considered the epitome of the unbridgeable distance between two different, let's say, areas, two different organizations in some way, two different unions, both in terms of economic interest and in terms of security interest. At the same time, the euro crisis has also deepened the division within the eurozone between different models of political economy and different cognitive orders for justifying them. Brexit is an epitome not only of an economic crisis, but with huge implications in security terms. Schauble and others never realized that asking Greece to go away from the Eurozone would have inevitable implication on the security term, especially in that area of the Mediterranean. So both levels of division between the Eurozone and the opt-out member state and within the Eurozone make difficult for the EU to identify a common perspective both on trade and security, a position then to negotiate with the US. So although, for example, trade policy is a supranational competence, the Commission is no longer able to play its exclusive role in that policy. The Council and the European Council has raised their own voice, and they want to condition the position of the Commission. At the same time, the European Parliament has started to question crucial chapters of the TTT, and the Council has been regularly paralyzed by its internal division regarding trade and, of course, regarding, for example, immigration. The meeting of yesterday is another example. Also facing a drama as the discovery of the immigrants dead in Austria, it was impossible for the European Council to reach a common reasonable position. So even in this crucial policy, it seems impossible for the EU as it is today to reach a common position. And of course, Europe suffers from the crisis in its neighborhood, like Africa and Middle East, but is unable to give a common answer. Each country tends to find its own solution. So I would say that this is not only part of the egotistic approach of a national leader, but has to do with the institutional structure, again, of core state power policy emigrated to the European Union. The example is the way in which the European Union dealt with the Ukrainian crisis, where the European interest was represented by the national leaders of Germany and France, and nobody knows why they were there, on the basis of which kind of legitimacy pattern they were there. So although Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, is shown to have a certain role as a High Representative in specific contexts, for example, in the negotiation with the Iranian Authority, one has to conclude that there is not yet the foundation for a common foreign policy, at least in security and military terms. A condition that is going to get worse with the UK drifting apart from the rest of the continent, regardless of the outcome of the referendum of the next year, or 2017. In any case, the UK now is more and more at the margin of the European Union, the integration project. So I ran to my conclusion. I wanted to be critical, but also leave some space for reflection. The US, as the EU, our polities highly not centralized. Regardless of what many people think about the US, a kind of nation state, the US is a union of states, and the decision-making process is organized around a system of separation of power that is not a system that helps to have easy decision. The same, of course, in a more dramatic sense, is the European Union. So they have necessary difficulties in dealing with external challenges. The golden year for both are the year in which they dealt with domestic issues, the long period in the US of the expansion, the long period in the European Union of enlargement. But they are basically domestic-based system. They can survive properly when they are not challenged by external threat. Because external threat in some way incentive process of centralization, and they are not prepared institutionally for dealing with that pressure to centralization. So in the case of the US, a lot will depend from the outcome of the 2016 presidential and congressional election. Although divided government has been the source of the incoherence of US policies, however, one has also to consider that is overcoming, for example, through a Republican majority across the three separated governmental institutions, might generate more problem than solutions. So divided government is a source of conflict, of permanent tension within the US system. But if in 2016 you will have across the board Republican majority, of course the Republican will control, to be sure, both chambers of the Congress. So if they win also the presidency, this Republican majority across the board might create more problems, and so it's not the solution per se, because of the ideological nature of the current Republican congressional elite. Probably a more assertive Democratic president, let's say Hillary Clinton, might build important bridges with the Republican Congress. Although this is not a guarantee that assertiveness can work in international conflicts. In the case of the EU, the future appears, at least to me, even more problematic. The EU, as we have known it, in my view, is dead. Insisting on the old therapy of an ever closer union, including all the European states, can kill the patient rather than saving him. So the EU should recognize that a differentiation is necessary between a Eurozone organized around new institutions, supranational and not only intergovernmental. Of course, they should be also intergovernmental. It's impossible to make foreign policy or economic policy in Europe without involving national governmental leaders. But they cannot be the only actors of the decision-making process. You need to find an original way of checking and balancing them with supranational institutions. And the Eurozone should find its own logic, distinct from the logic of the non-Eurozone. And the non-Eurozone should be, the non-Eurozone and the Eurozone should be part of a common project, the project of a common market, and also the project of a common defense. It is plausible that the UK will not be part of a more strict core group of countries moving within the Eurozone towards deeper integration. But it's not plausible at all to leave the UK outside of any form of cooperation in Europe. UK should be part of the common market. UK should be part of a common defense. That requires new thought. Europeans should be original. There is too much laziness, too much intellectual laziness. We follow established patterns. We think that the future will be similar to the past. No longer. We have to, this is a moment in which we have to rethink radically the condition of keeping state together. So this implies different policies with different constellation of actors. At the core of this pluralistic Europe and multiple union, to recognize that within the European Union there are more than one union, there are more than one form of cooperation, should be, of course, a Euro Union based on a constitutional pact between its member states. And that should be the basis, for example, of trade policy vis-à-vis the US. So the European situation will be still complicated from an external point of view, but if we move in this institutionalization of differentiation, at least it will be possible to know which union is responsible for which policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Sergio. We will